had a like I had like a 45 minute talk prepared. I want to cut that down significantly. So hopefully I'll only go for like 25, maybe 30 minutes. I just want to make sure we have enough time for discussion. And really there's a part of me that's kind of just wondering uh, if we should just have a conversation, but I feel kind of indebted to bring something to the table. Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about my background, some aspects of the state of our politics right now, and then some resources that are available uh, in the kingdom of God that I think we too often discount as having public value. We too often, I think, feel pretty confident that Jesus has something for our personal lives, that Jesus might have something to tell us about our finances or navigating relationships. Um, Too often, I'm concerned that we might think that Jesus isn't quite up to the task of public challenges, and I want to address that. So let me dive in, and then I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And again, to those who led us in worship, I just really want to thank you for that. I became a Christian after reading Romans when I was about 15 years old. Um, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, in a I'd say a pretty nominally Catholic family, although I had, as I look back, I think of like, that aunt who would be praying her rosary in, the corner chair in the living room. Or I think about the fact that my grandfather would say it was the Lord who saw him through World War II. But just growing up, it didn't seem, well, so when I was writing my first book, I interviewed my mom, and I asked her, about the role of religion for her growing up. And my mom said, well, it was just like brushing your teeth in the morning. You just did it, which which is, not the most rousing call to faith, not the most, theologically rooted, explanation. But, that was what it was. Uh, there's a longer story here, but my sister became a Christian uh, a few years before I did. And all of a sudden I had an evangelist next door. And I was, not just indifferent towards faith, but kind of antagonistic in like a pseudo intellectual, precocious kind of way. All the typical line, all religion is a crutch, dun dun dun. Um, a few key things happen by, the providence of the Holy Spirit. Concretely, my sister asked me to go to her youth group. And I went, I hated it. I didn't fit in. I didn't get the language, nothing. But on the way out, there was a volunteer there who was handing out tracts of Romans, just Romans, just Paul's letter, no commentary, no nothing. I took it. I took it home and read it again and read it again. And it changed my life. I'd give my life to Christ soon thereafter. But the other thread that was running longer was music. So from a very young age, like 2-3 years old, I loved R&B music. And my mother would listen, like she was a big Keith Sweat fan, so we'd have like Keith Sweat on in the house. And then I got into Drew Hill was my group growing up, and loved Maxwell, loved D'Angelo, and I just listened to music and sang all the time growing up, and I'd go anywhere where this music was. And well, so there was this back in my day, there were like these CD schemes where you'd get like these little flyers, and it would be like, get like 27 CDs for like 8 cents, as long as you buy the first CD for like $30. And it was a big racket. If you didn't pay on time and they made it hard to pay, you'd end up having to pay all these other fees. But I was able to convince my mother to do this after some hounding. And I picked out all the CDs I knew, but another part of the racket is they only have so many CDs in one genre or in one style. And so you'd have to branch out. And I had like, a few CDs left to pick out of this thing. And there was a live album. Again, I may be aging myself here, from Commissioned. So try to think, if y'all don't know, Fred was on a Kanye West album. I mean, maybe y'all, okay, maybe y'all do know Commission, but I picked that album up, and it was my first gospel album, and was deeply moved by it. And then another album came out. Lauryn Hill had an unplugged album that came out, and the whole album is just incredible. There's a song at the end of the first the first CD. Again, I don't know if y'all are tracking with me, but there was a song at the end of the first CD, I Gotta Find Peace of Mind. And I heard that, and it was a similar experience emotionally to reading Romans, which was, you read Romans and you could reject Jesus after reading Romans, but you can no longer say that there's no there. You can no longer say that there's no argument, that there's no substance. And similarly, when I heard Lauren sing, I Gotta Find Peace of Mind, there's the end of the track. There's something that happens that sort of transcends performance. And so all of this, directed by the Holy Spirit, led to me giving my life to Christ in the car with my sister a few days after I read Romans. And for a while, I thought I was already interested in politics. I become a Christian. I figure, well, now I need to. Now I probably just need to go to seminary, become a pastor. You just want to do like the most Christian thing possible. Thankfully, I had a pastor in my life who said, Michael, look around. There are Christians who are not pastors, and I said, that's a good observation. I should have noticed that. And so very early on, the vocational question that's sort of driven my life has been, what does it mean to be faithful in public things? And so there's a Commission had this, had an album, the title track was The Ordinary Just Won't Do. I don't know if y'all know this song. It goes, ordinary just won't do. I need love that's pure and true. I can always find it in you, Jesus. It's a great song. Y'all should pick it up if you don't have it. But that was on that two CD live album that I got when I was an adolescent. And that song's meant a lot to me, and it's gained meaning to me as I've navigated public questions. I came to understand that in politics, as in all of life, the ordinary just won't do. And it's not simply that the ordinary just won't do because it's not pure enough or holy enough. The ordinary just won't do because the ordinary just isn't working. And so what is the ordinary? What's ordinary in this country is the idea that religion and politics are the two topics you're not supposed to discuss at the dinner table, right? The two topics that you don't talk about in polite company. It wasn't until recently I came to think that the saying is generally true, but for opposing reasons. People don't want to talk about politics because they hold their views too tightly. Too much of their identity is staked in politics. People don't want to talk about religion because they are haunted by the idea that they do not stake their lives in the spiritual things enough, that God takes up too little space in their life. In his essay, Membership, C.S. Lewis writes, "A sick society must think much about politics as a sick man must think much about his digestion. However, if either comes to regard it as the natural food of the mind, if either forgets that we think of such things only in order to be able to think of something else, then what was undertaken for the sake of health has become itself a new and deadly disease." Our culture and many people in our churches are sick with that new and deadly disease. Politics is causing great spiritual harm in America. Spiritual harm is ordinary, it's common. The American Psychological Association found that 52% of Americans felt additional stress due to a recent presidential election. They called it election stress disorder. The APA had to establish a term for this, and they recommended steps that people could take for relief. Teachers reported students were fearful about the election outcome, even to the extent that they were having nightmares about it. Political campaigns understand and feed into this emotional pull of politics. Increasingly, political messages are not about politics. Instead, the policies proposed on the campaign trail are about sending a message and propping up a desired narrative. Our politics, and this is important, our politics is both driven by and guiding our emotions. The influence of political tactics is not confined to campaign dynamics. It affects how we are formed as people. Political polarization, in terms of party, in terms of what social scientists refer to as affective polarization, which essentially means that people are divided. This is a kind of polarization that is not so much about substantive disagreement, but about a difference fueled by animosity. It's a polarization driven not by what you're for, but by what people are against. And that's an all-time high in the modern era, according to a Stanford study that came out in 2014. Instead of our values influencing our politics, our political circumstances are shaping our values. As partisans, we explain away the flaws of the candidate we support and buy nearly any outlandish theory about the candidate we oppose. We even change what we believe to fit the moment. Politics is causing great spiritual harm in Americans' lives, and a big reason for that is Americans are going to politics to have their spiritual needs met. This is the meaning of rising polarization. It's the cause of our zero-sum mentality. Politics does a poor job of meeting spiritual needs, but if it will get your vote, politicians will attempt to fill the spiritual void nonetheless. Our politics can only cause such spiritual harm because our national life has become so spiritually vacuous. What we must recognize if we are to properly diagnose and treat that which ails our politics is that the state of our politics is a reflection of the state of our souls. That politicians can only manipulate those most personal parts of ourselves, our longings, our loves, our hurts, our passions, and our hatreds for their purposes, because we make these things available for their use. The problem is not that we take politics too seriously, but that we take politics seriously in all of the wrong ways. It is ordinary to go to politics for self-interest, self-expression, self-affirmation, self-validation, but the ordinary just won't do. Another way the ordinary just won't do is the way we think about political parties. The seriousness with which we take our political party, The weight we give to our partisan affiliation is a driver of, and in some ways synonymous with, the kind of polarization we see today. Because our parties are so polarized and partisan identity is so profound, we find that politicians and political parties have inordinate influence over the views of the citizenry. We have not invested such meaning into what a political party is and what it means to affiliate with one because of the nature of a political party, but because of what is in the interest of political parties and the other political actors who benefit from them. That is to say, political parties demand our allegiance not because it is their right, but because it is in their interest. Instead, we should be members of a political party because we believe things. We should not believe things because we are members of a political party. When you go to the DMV to register for to vote, and you're able to register for a political party, there's no fine print at the bottom of that document that says, I hereby sign over my conscience to every jot and tittle of the party platform. We join a party to influence that party, not for the party to influence us. This is a better way. The old way, where we get our marching orders from political parties, that's not right. It doesn't have to be normal, but it's ordinary today. And the ordinary just won't do. Part of the reason our politics is in its current state is that we are in a vicious feedback loop of a citizenry that makes itself available for and incentivizes political tactics that degrade people and degrade our politics, which leads to a normalization or routinization and embeddedness of these kinds of political tactics and approaches. Of course, Christians have been as complicit as anyone else in the state of our politics. The problem is not so much that there are broad swaths of Christians who make exceptionally bad contributions to our politics, but rather that for many, there is nothing exceptional about their politics at all. We are so often driven by the same self-interested, self-protecting motives as other voters. We are so often prone to the same partisan rationalizations, the politics of contempt, as our political opponents, whoever they are. In the introduction to his book, The Great Omission, Dallas Willard observes that, quote, there is a great deal of disappointment expressed today about the character and the effects of Christian people, about Christian institutions, and at least by implication about the Christian faith and understanding of reality. Most of the disappointment comes from Christians themselves, who find that what they profess, quote, just isn't working, not for themselves, nor as far as they can see for those around them. Willard wrote elsewhere that, quote, we have been through a period when the dominant theology simply had nothing to do with discipleship. It had to do with proper belief, with God seeing to it that individuals did not go to the bad place, but to the good place. But that happened in such a way that the predominant thought is that a person can have the worst character possible and still get into the good place if he believed the right thing. This disconnection became increasingly burdensome to the church itself until we came to the point that, as is widely discussed, there is not a clear difference between Christians and those who are not Christians. End quote. I want to suggest to you that at the very heart of what ails us as a people and as a nation is a failure to trust Jesus, a failure to apprentice ourselves to Jesus for the purpose of becoming more like him. This matter of discipleship, in the end, is not really a choice. We will be discipled by something or somebody. Our affections will be directed. They are never really aimless. And it is into this vacuum created by the Great Omission that, among other things, politics has become one of the primary disciplers of our day. Are we allowing politics to disciple us? Has politics come to take up emotional and spiritual space in our lives that it does not deserve? And what are we seeking from politics when we go to it? I believe politics has become an idol for many, those who would identify as Christian and those who would not. It is shaping and directing our affections, leading us to justify things that we'd otherwise deem unjustifiable, and leading us to act in ways that we would otherwise find unthinkable. What I want to do is begin to stake in us an imagination for what our politics would look like if Christians were more Christian. How might we think about politics differently if we participated in politics grounded in a confidence that Jesus actually has something worthwhile to offer us in that endeavor? What would an extraordinary Christian politics look like? Here's one example from, believe it or not, a presidential campaign. It's a reminder to me that our politics can create good culture, not just division and insecurity. Jenna Lee Nardella is a friend of mine. She's also something of a wonderkind. At age 22, Jenna co-founded and served as the executive director of an organization called Blood Water Mission, a nonprofit that has raised more than $25 million, brought water to more than 1 million people, provided healthcare for more than 62,000 people in HIV-affected areas. And Jenna's influence and example have had an outsized impact on the justice conversation in the American church. Certainly sectors of the streams of the American church. The Democratic Convention lasts 3 days. And in 2012, I was the faith outreach director for Barack Obama's presidential campaign. And so I had that year, I think, 6 slots to fill for the invocation and benediction each night. And I asked Jenna Lee to serve in one of them. For an evangelical Christian, the decision to speak at an event like this cannot be taken lightly. Kind of the last thing you want to do is get involved in a controversy that could harm your ministry, either from anti-religious inquiry or from a donor base that would be upset that you would dare pray with Democrats. Jenna asked for a bit of time to consider the invitation and prayed with her husband, the board of her organization, consulted with them. They encouraged her to take the opportunity, and Jenna accepted. I smiled when I received an email from a campaign staffer just a day or two before Jenna was set to speak, flagging something in Jenna's prepared benediction. It was Jenna had included in her benediction a prayer for Mitt Romney, too, the Republican nominee for president. I assured my colleague that this would be okay and that, well, it was too late to negotiate an alternative. And so on the night of the convention, and you can look this up, directly following First Lady Michelle Obama's keynote that evening, First Lady Michelle Obama leaves the stage. Jenna walks out, and with heads bowed and eyes closed, after, political conventions are entirely about talking about how great you are and how awful the other party is. And so after, at this point, multiple days of that kind of content, Jenna walks out, and with heads bowed and eyes closed, she led a stadium full of Democrats in praying for Barack Obama and for Mitt Romney and for our nation. The prayer was a ray of light in what was a pretty depressing campaign season. Christians and others shared the video of Jenna's prayer online as an example of what can happen when we hold our faith and each other's dignity as more sacred than partisan politics. It would have been ordinary, expected for Jenna to have gone to that convention, prayed for the audience's politics to triumph, ordinary to just pray for the Democrats at the Democratic convention. That wouldn't have been sort of out of place. That would have fit right in. But for Jenna, the ordinary just wouldn't do. In an increasingly polarized politics and culture, this is a powerful posture that we can take. We can take risks in the political arena to affirm that some things are more foundational than partisan politics. And when we see others do so, we can support them as they face people who do not understand. What Jenna taught us that evening was that politics can be about more than winning. Here's one other example of how a biblical imagination might might fuel a distinctly Christian politics. When the Apostle Paul was writing to the Galatians, he was addressing a community that was in deep disunity. Paul had helped form the Galatians through his teachings, but they were straying from foundational commitments. Sin, false teachers, parochial motives and interests were creating, well, polarization. Paul's letter to the Galatians is essentially a letter to a polarized community in which Paul attempts to speak clarity into the conflict and help the community reform around its foundations. And it was into this polarized environment that Paul instructs them to do something radical, something completely contrary to everything polarization promotes. He says that they ought to, quote, carry one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the love of Christ. It's Galatians 6:2. Paul's command shows no favoritism. His call is not to one group only, to those with power or without it, or even solely to the strong or the weak. Everyone together is a part of a community as children of the same God, and therefore they ought to carry one another's burdens. A nation is a different sort of community, but it is a community. And the call to carry another's burden is an extraordinary one. But these are extraordinary times. In our increasingly polarized nation, when many elected officials and their strategists believe that they need to listen only to those who already agree with them, we must carry our neighbors' burdens into politics with our own. We should ensure those we disagree with are heard as well. Opening up our narrow politics will not be easy, but it's possible. It's not ordinary, but we need extraordinary anyways. Politics cannot just be a forum for self-expression and the pursuit of self-affirmation. We must carry one another's burdens. The question is, are people coming to politics with the resources of their faith? Or are they leaving those resources behind to participate in politics? It was John Stott who wrote that when society does go bad, we Christians tend to throw up our hands in pious horror and reproach the non-Christian world. But should we not rather reproach ourselves? One can hardly blame unsalted meat for going bad. It cannot do anything else. The real question to ask is, where is the salt? Where is the salt? I've served in the White House. I've seen our politics up close. Let me tell you, our politics needs the salt. It doesn't need more ordinary. Ordinary is the politics of self-interest that we have right now that leaves the common good and the well-being of the disinherited last, while those with power get first dibs. Ordinary is a zero-sum politics. We need Christians who understand the ordinary just won't do. Ordinary is a politics of animosity, where we claim the public interest, but despise half the public. That just won't do. Ordinary is a politics of tribal performance for public affirmation, but unwillingness to actually listen, to do the work, to sacrifice. That just won't do. Ordinary is a politics that tweets and bloviates, but is detached from the actual local communities in which people are placed in, where you could actually be attentive to what's going on around you. We need something different. We need Christians to be different. And in Jesus, we have all the resources to be just that. We need to become the kind of people our politics needs, not just ask what our politics, what we need from our politics. And the ordinary just won't do. So with that, I'll close my remarks, but really looking forward to conversation with all of you. Thank you so much.
Wow, powerful stuff, and you know, you had bars like every minute or so, and it really hits hard. Like politics, almost filling a spiritual void. It seems like that it's so easy to fall into when politics is all that's on for 4 or 5 months out of the year, all that's on your phone, all that's on the TV or whatnot, and it seems like it takes almost a precedent over that. But that reminder you gave us about the importance of, filling that spiritual void with what what we know should be right is definitely pertinent and relevant in this, at least for me. So we'll move over to, we have a running doc. Please add your questions. The link should be in the chat. If you don't know, Slido, hashtag DOXA. And our most upvoted questions asking, like, how do we address individuals who identify strongly with matters of political issue without discrediting their choice to do so? How do we interact with, our fellow man who have very strong opinions that differ?
Yeah, I mean, right. So I think, generally speaking, we can be thankful for that passion. We can be thankful that God has placed in people's lives and experiences something to give them conviction about. And there are serious issues that our politics has a role in addressing that I said in my remarks, the problem is not that we take politics seriously, but that we take it seriously in all the wrong ways. And part of what I mean by that is, we treat politics as this ultimate form of entertainment. And what happens when you do that is you actually, there's no room or less room. If you're going to politics to get spiritual and emotional needs met, that means that you're not freed up to enter politics for the limited work that politics is meant for, which is, a shorthand. It's to affirm human dignity and advance justice. Like, a big problem with our politics right now is it's taken up with all this other, every animosity, every aspiration people have. And then we wonder why we can't focus on the real need that is out there. And so, generally speaking, like, I want to affirm civic involvement. I want to affirm folks who, especially those who are taking a concrete issue seriously and have done their research and are doing real work to see what they hope to be positive change. Now, for Christians, there's certainly a role for activism. I believe that. I mean, that's why I'm involved in politics. I will say one thing that Christians bring to bear on this, though, is a sense of, there's a philosopher, Jamie Smith, who says that, Christians' political involvement should be tinged with ambivalence. And I think that's exactly right. That we should be involved in politics, but because we understand that politics is not ultimate, that there's a kingdom which supersedes all earthly kingdoms, because we understand that politics is ultimately prudential. In other words, we may feel strongly, we may have done all the research, we may feel minimum wage has to be here, taxes have to be here, this is the best way to get people health care, this is the best way to take care of the environment, etc. In the back of our minds, we have both the historical perspective that the history of public policy in this country and every other is a history of unintended consequences, a history of good intentions leading to dangerous places, and of misguided intentions doing worse. And so we have a humility about the ability of policy instruments to sort of accomplish everything that we would want them to accomplish. And so our politics is tinged with ambivalence. Another thing that does is it means that, for Christians, our political engagement, the ends don't justify the means. And this is something that is lacking in so I had intended to talk a bit tonight about Howard Thurman. Thurman has his classic book is this book, Jesus and the Disinherited. And I would really encourage you, I was going to talk about it for like 15 minutes tonight, but decided to go in a different direction. But there's a chapter in that book on hate. And I would really encourage y'all, I mean, it's like 7-8 pages. I mean, you could read the whole book tonight if you haven't read it yet. And Thurman diagnoses and then provides an antidote to diagnosis, describes why hatred is destructive to the human soul, really regardless of its source or its justification, and then provides an antidote in a way that is just deeply, deeply applicable to the political scene today. For Christians, because we have this tinge of ambivalence in politics, it just means that we're not going to destroy people in order to achieve political aims. Like, we're just not going to lie in order to get what we want politically, because again, we're following a higher order of things than just sort of temporal political success and policy instruments. But I'll end my comments there. But it's a really important question.
Thank you for that. Another one, how do we distinguish issues that Christians should support versus those that are like merely partisan divides?
So I think there are all kinds of resources that are available to us. You know, we don't need to invent any of this whole cloth. We got traditions of theological, institutional, civic, where we don't need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to Christian political engagement. Now, we need to sift through that. We don't want to sort of take on anything wholesale. We want to apply a biblical lens even to what Christians have done in the past. But I just mean that to say, you know, there are some themes that sort of transcend through time. So, you know, the Catholics call it the preferential option for the poor, but there are various ways of the different traditions approach it. But there's a clear biblical through line that Christians ought to be especially attentive to the dispossessed in their politics, what Thurman called the disinherited. Questions that go to the human person, questions that go to the dignity of human life, have been especially pervasive through Christian social action. And so there are themes, clear biblical themes that we can rely on, trust, and apply to the questions of our day. What I'd say though is, so that's all true. What I would also say is, you know, and this is just, you know, biblical, but there's so much of the Bible we just don't think applies to public things. And that is, there's benefit to being the body of Christ. So I am adopted. And so my politics, I'm especially attentive to. I had the opportunity to work on the adoption tax credit when I was in the White House. I'm attentive to those things in a way that if I wasn't adopted, I probably wouldn't be. Now, I could make a whole biblical argument. I think adoption is a reflection of God's love for us. I was like, you know, we could run it down. For me to impose that on everybody and say, you have to care about adoption just as much as I do. And if you don't prioritize it in the same way I prioritize it, you aren't being faithful. That would be religious manipulation on my part. Similarly, I would expect that, you know, if folks work at an international aid organization, you're going to be more attentive to how politicians, you know, support the foreign aid budget than maybe I'm going to be. It's what you work on. If you have a set of political concerns that are tied to other aspects of your history. When I grew up, we were on food stamps, so I have an appreciation for SNAP that other people just might not have. Now, we should learn from one another. I'm not saying you know, we need to have an other-centered politics. But what I'd also say is there's benefit to diversity in the kingdom of God. There's benefit to diversity of interests and passions. We can't all care about the same things in the same way. And so I am generally confident that if we had more Christians thinking Christianly about politics, and that's not always going to lead to the same policy position, that's not going to always lead to the same hierarchy of concerns, but if we have more Christians who are thinking Christianly about politics, we'd be in a much better place than we are now. Like I'm going to put my confidence in people following the Holy Spirit as it calls them. And yes, we could challenge each other when necessary, etc. But I feel much more confident in that than me trying to lay out or dictate to everybody else what they need to care about in a dogmatic way. Now, right, like in the public square, that's what it's all about. So, if we're in a political discourse, then obviously the whole thing is to say, well, I think you should prioritize this over that. I think you should approach this problem in this way. But for Christians, it's really important that when we go there, we need to be clear. Look, I'm guided by scriptural principles here. I'm guided by my faith, but this is my prudential application of what I believe to be eternal truths. My political opinion is not an eternal truth. we so often get that twisted, and it's so easy to jump to that religious manipulation of, I feel that God cares about this issue. I've done my research and think the best way to address this issue is this. And so therefore, this approach is the biblical approach. And I just say, C.S. Lewis has this essay, Meditations on the Third Commandment, where he says, basically, like the major temptation when you combine faith and politics is to claim God hath said when God has not spoken. And we want to be really careful about that. Again, because it's religious manipulation, but most importantly, if we proclaim our political views as religious dogma, when we actually have to proclaim the gospel, we're actually undermining our ability to proclaim the gospel with authority because we've misused the gospel authority on prudential issues where God has not spoken.
And you touched on an idea that is kind of popping up in another question, like, say, that sort of idea of avoiding like religious manipulation or claiming religion in those sort of senses. Like, how do you navigate conversations with single issue voters who are also fellow believers and are not opening to hearing other different beliefs? We have like people close to us who may be under that sort of in that sort of situation. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there are individual conversations where I just want to alleviate you of the burden of feeling like you gotta convince everybody in your path, even those you're close to see things differently. If you feel that calling, like, I'm not telling you to reject that calling, but we're in a time right now where, Thanksgiving comes up and there are people who are saying, hey, if you aren't picking a fight with your crazy uncle, then you're not, you're not really with it. And I just want to say, like, it may not be fruitful to pick that fight. Like, use some discernment there. So that would be on the individual level. Like, I don't want to have anyone feel like a burden, like you're responsible for the views of everybody around you. Generally when we're talking about single issue voters, Christians who are single issue voters, and I don't say this to be trite, but is God a single issue God? I think so often people are single issue voters because it's a way to alleviate the tension that's present in our politics that is inherent. And what we do when we try and get rid of that tension arbitrarily is we tell a lie about the reality of things. When instead, as Christians, we ought to be able to hold that tension before God and say, look, this issue is pulling a lot of weight for me. And this issue is dictating a lot of who I vote for. But that doesn't mean all these other things don't exist. Like, you have to own up. So I'm being led to vote for this candidate because of this issue. but I disagree with them on A, B, and C. And as someone who supported them, I'm going to use whatever additional influence that gives me as a citizen, as a supporter of that candidate. Maybe you have a platform, maybe you have some route to that person. I'm going to use the influence I have as their supporter to push them on those areas where they stand, where I don't feel they're in line with, they're not in line with my view of things, and I think that they're in contradiction of a biblical view of things. It's that artificial sort of, well, because this issue is important, everything you're talking about doesn't matter. No, it doesn't matter. It matters to God. If it matters to God, it better matter to us. What we have to acknowledge is that our politics is such, there is no algorithm in which you can perfectly tabulate, all the decisions, for instance, a president has to make, but even a city manager has to make. There's no algorithm that you could have where you can take in all the factors and it comes out, at the other end of the calculator. Like, we all just got to do the best we can with the information we can, in prayer and discernment, in consultation with, I'm not going to have time to talk about this, but there are a range of questions that I've offered for people. In the 90s, there were these voter guides that were basically telling you who to vote for. Again, I think that can be a kind of religious manipulation. I've offered just some questions that people should be asking. Questions like, what are the most pressing needs facing the most vulnerable in the community in which you live? So in consultation with community and consultation with scripture, we just got to make the best choice that we can. And listen, when you step into the voting booth, you don't walk behind the curtain, close the door, and God is like kept outside. Then you got to make your decision. You walk out and, oh, Jesus, you have no idea what it was like in there. You should have seen what I had to deal with. He's right there. All right. We need to have some confidence that Jesus gets it, that Jesus could have been a political scientist. Like, he's not scared or confused by any of this stuff. And so we can rest in that a little bit. He's not blind to the circumstances of our lives. And I'm sorry, my I got a 2-year-old, so if you hear a baby crying, that's my girl going down to bed at 9:15. I guess we're sleeping in tomorrow morning, which is good, but sorry about that if she's making a little noise.
No problem. That's wonderful. We have an international community that we love, and so and some of them are here with us. We have an international HCFA community. What would you say to those who aren't American?
Yeah. Well, so I'm really, I have experience in some parts of the world, in Lebanon, in the UK, but every place is different. And I'm really careful to, I'm not sure if the kinds of political obligations that I talked about in my talk, I don't think that they transcend culture, that they transcend time and place. It's very much situated for American life and more broadly representative democracies. In other words, if you're from a country in which there's no mechanism for civic participation, then the burden on you, the sort of Jeremiah 29 burden of seeking the peace and welfare of the city in which I've placed you, is just different because God has placed you somewhere different. And so I'm really humble about and really actually kind of shy about talking about what folks from other sort of political contexts need to do, because I just don't have much. I don't know what the Christian civic obligation is in a straight monarchy, for instance. I just think it works out differently. What I guess the general thing I'd say is, you know, I find that especially, you know, being a part of Harvard, being a part of any sort of community, especially intellectual community, as an international student, you know, you bring a perspective that is not shaped by some of the more destructive impulses of American politics right now. And that can be a gift to your peers to say, to just be that voice that says, oh, it's interesting that you think about it this way. Like, that's funny. Where I'm from, that's not even a debate. And y'all are all like wound up about it, which is like, it's just interesting, and just like poke through some of that. So I think you have a perspective that doesn't disqualify you from participation. It actually empowers you in some pretty helpful and singularly powerful ways in this environment. And so I'd encourage you to find opportunities to bring that perspective to bear.
Great, thank you, Michael. Next question. In this day and age, is it beneficial for a Christian to consider himself or herself a member of a particular political party?
Yeah, so it's so funny, you know, my first book, I have like entire chapters on abortion and religious freedom and all these. And the most controversial part of my book is I have like 2 paragraphs on political party affiliation. And I always, like, I got surprised, like, for the first few months of getting the book out, that was the thing that, like, and the argument I make there is, you know, in America, we have a pretty firmly established 2-party system. I think there's a whole lot of rhetoric surrounding. And so, well, before I go any further, just again, I want to affirm this is not to place individual burdens on anybody. And like, if you're staying up at night with your conscience wrecked about joining a political party, I probably would hold off on it. But generally speaking, there's a lot of rhetoric around independence that I think is, you know, self-congratulatory in a way that doesn't reflect reality. And I know that sounds blunter than I mean it, but let me tell you what I mean. So we have the highest percentage of political independence in American history ever right now. It's like 45-47% of Americans are political independents. Yet with the rhetoric of around, you know, so often the rhetoric around becoming political independent is, you know, independents are sending a message to the 2 parties that, you know, they haven't done enough to earn their vote. You know, independents are not, you know, ceding to the, you know, monopoly on political views that the 2 parties have claimed, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I just suggest that, considering the fact that we have the highest percentage of independents ever in American history, and our system is more polarized at a party level than ever before, that maybe like independents aren't sending the message they intend. What I've argued instead is that actually what's happened is that as we've seen independence, the number of independents rise, driven by folks who, you know, say that they don't fit in neatly with any political party. They don't agree with any political party. What that does is it removes the internal energy from a party to mediate itself, to moderate itself, to negotiate within itself. In other words, if all we have left in the political parties are those who can agree with every jot and tittle of the party platform, there's no mechanism through which the party can be anything else than what it is. And so what I've argued is, and I touch on this a bit in my remarks, you know, political parties, it is easier for them to treat themselves like they're a brand. Like, oh, you become a Democrat or Republican, you stamp that on your forehead and you do kind of whatever they tell you. That makes their jobs easier, but that's not what political parties are for. I'll tell you one quick story, which is I spoke to the Sioux County. I was speaking at a Christian college in Iowa, in Sioux County, the most conservative county in Iowa, and the local Democratic chapter heard that I was going to be speaking at this campus, and so they asked me to speak to them. And I decided, you know, what the heck, I'm not really in party politics anymore, so I figured I'll go to the Sioux County Democrats and talk about the fact that political parties don't have a claim on your conscience the way they want you to. So I gave this talk and was expected to get, you know, run out of into the cornfields of Iowa and just, you know, left out there to die or whatever. But I finished my remarks, and the vice chair of the local Democratic Party stands up, and I'm like, oh, here it comes. And they asked, the question was something along the lines of, you know, there's something in the platform that has been bugging me, and I didn't realize I could do anything about it. How would I go about contesting something that's in the Democratic Party platform? And I said, not only can you do that, that's your job. The whole point of the party is to mediate differences within those who are members. And so, you know, again, I don't mean to place a burden on people individually to join a political party. What I want to say is that you can be a Democrat and disagree with the Democratic position on any range of issues. There's no real mechanism to enforce uniformity. The reason you'd be a Democrat or the reason you would be a Republican is because you judge that in general, one party is closer to what you think is best for the country in that moment than the other. And then number two, because you think the party you join is a vehicle for you to be a part of a discourse that could not just change the country, but move that party in a better direction. I guess the last thing I'd say is, like, the Democratic Party, and I don't mean to get into issues here, but, you know, just from my perspective, the Democratic Party needs nothing more right now than Democrats who are proud to be Democrats, identify as Democrat, who are nonetheless willing to challenge the party from the inside as a Democrat on issues of human dignity. The Republican Party needs nothing more than Republicans who are proud to be Republican, who identify as Republican, or are willing to challenge that party on the inside on issues concerning voting rights and immigration. That's a beautiful thing, and that's what the parties need, or else they're just going to be driven by whoever sort of is able to call the shots at the time, because there's no internal competition.
That was a lot of wisdom. And I think we're moving on to our last question, which is there a space for Christians to enact legislation that affects non-Christians?
Yes, in the sense that that's the system we have, not solely for, we're all part of a political community together. Now, I think the Christian's responsibility is to ensure that what they're advancing truly is intended for the good of their neighbors. You know, that's the Augustinian sense of the word love. To love is to will the good of your neighbors and even your quote unquote political enemies. So Christians, really, public servants generally, really all citizens, but Christians especially, have to be able to say that what they're advocating is truly for the good of their neighbors. And I would venture to suggest that if you think that God is calling you to advocate for something which is not good for your neighbors, then you need to get right with God you need to get on the same page with God on that. In other words, if you think God is calling you to do something that isn't good for people, then that's more of a statement of your view of God than anything else. But yes, I mean, we're all part of this political community together. And so this whole idea that Christians are the only people who can't bring their values to bear in politics, that's actually, my former boss, Barack Obama, said that was a practical absurdity. In 2006, he gave a speech at the Call to Renewal conference, where he said that secularists were wrong to ask Christians to leave their faith out of I mean, it's just reality. He gave a speech where he said the secularists were wrong to ask people of faith to leave their faith outside the door of their politics. And he said that when people called for that, they may not realize it, but what they're doing is saying that they want to erase Frederick Douglass from American political history. They want to take Lincoln out. They want to take King out. They want to take Dorothy Day out. Some of the social reforms that are most championed by those who now say that Christians shouldn't be able to bring their faith to bear would not have happened if there weren't Christians bringing their faith to bear on political discussions. Now we could go a whole bunch of places from there. There are those who argue that when Christians do enter the public square, they ought to be able to argue for, because we think that what we believe is good for all people, we ought to be able to express our political convictions in ways that are accessible to all people. I don't necessarily buy into, I think that can be helpful, but I don't necessarily want to say that folks can't cite scripture if that's the best way they know how to express themselves. But there's a whole lot of, but that's my basic answer there. Like, yes, bring your values to bear. Just make sure they're the right value. Make sure that you have a view of God that is actually willing the good of people, and not just using God to create this system of animosities and then acting on a God who's antagonistic towards all the people that you're antagonistic to. That's not God.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks so much for your thoughtful responses and the amazing talk. And we all learned so much. Yeah.
So thank you.
Mhm.